Why hasn't anything been done about commercial fishing and pay lakes? In this video, we're going to talk about commercial fishing and the statistics behind it that the states and the state wildlife departments use to shoot down any amendments to catfishing regulations, pretty much all over the Midwest. But before we get into that, let's talk a little bit about what pay lakes are. Pay lakes are basically small ponds. They call them lakes, but they're really just ponds. And they're usually about 1 to 3 acres, and they're not very deep, and you pay money to go and fish them. Now, there are 2 different kinds of pay lakes. There are what I call ethical and unethical pay lakes. An ethical pay lake is a pay lake that buys its fish from a hatchery. These are places where they farm fish, and they can be caught and then taken and consumed. Nobody really has a problem with these kinds of pay lakes, and they exist for trout and carp and catfish. And I've even heard of pay lakes for crappies and things like that too. But the pay lakes we're talking about today are actually specifically called trophy catfish pay lakes. These pay lakes get their fish from commercial fishermen who catch them alive out of major bodies of water. Typically places like the Ohio River, the Mississippi, which turns out is a pretty big problem. But it's not even probably the worst problem. The worst problem are the places where they put these fish. They put these fish in these tiny ponds that they always call lakes. None of them are lakes. There's no food because they don't want them eating. They want them eating your bait with a hook in it. And so they don't put any food in there. There's no little fish for them to eat. In the unlikely event that a snake or something finds its way into this pond, it's going to be unfortunate for that snake. But other than that, there's really nothing in there for these fish to eat, nothing. And so over time, they literally slowly starve to death. Another issue is these fish are what they call juicing. They don't actually juice the fish, but they juice the water. Well, basically, they just take copper sulfate. If you don't know what copper sulfate is a chemical that is used to treat ponds and small lakes for things like algae and other aquatic invasive species, usually privately. So you know your backyard ponds and stuff that overgrow with algae, they use copper sulfate to kill it all. Copper in and of itself is a toxic element to all aquatic life. That's salamanders, frogs, fish, virtually every single piece of vegetation, and algae for that matter. All plankton, everything that lives in the water, it kills it. Normally you would only do like part of a pond, a quarter of a pond, half of a pond. That way it gives everything an opportunity to go to the other side. That's how toxic it is. Well, what they do in these pay lakes is they sprinkle a little bit all over the pond. And what that does is that keeps fish up off the bottom, and it keeps them moving. It also keeps them angry. There's evidence of this we only just heard about, and we would see the evidence of it where you'd see these fish that would have huge rashes and stuff and lesions all over their bodies, especially underneath. That's irritation from the toxins in the copper sulfate. So basically you've got starving, angry, in pain, pissed off fish, so they bite a lot. We're talking catch rates that can be as high as 60 fish in 30 minutes or an hour. It really is a remarkable thing to think about that people would do something like this. And on top of that, these fish are getting caught constantly. So they're getting hooks in their mouths a lot. So a lot of these fish develop bacterial infections around their faces, huge sores and things like that around their mouths because they're just being caught constantly, multiple dozen times a day or more. Most of these fish die within a couple of weeks of being put in there. The solution for that is another truckload of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 8,000, 9,000 pounds of fish that are getting pulled out of public water. They just put more in. And they take those fish and they put them in dumpsters when they die. They bury them in holes or they throw them in the woods. That's what they do. I'm not going to go into much greater detail about what happens at these pay lakes, primarily because there's a lot of videos out there that cover this extensively. But just to give you context of what we're talking about and the serious nature of this video, I wanted you to understand that that's what we're dealing with, and that's why I'm making this video. So without further ado, let's look at some of the data and the studies that every single time catfish amendments are proposed oftentimes they get shot down. This is when you get a lot of belly aching from the catfish, the sport fishing community. It's not just the sport fishing community, it's the fishing community as a whole. So how is it exactly that these commercial fishing operations can literally just set hoop nets and pull out thousands of pounds of fish and sell them to private landowners? Let's just make an analogy real quick of how crazy that is. This is a public resource that public pays for, that we elect people that then appoint people to look over this natural public resource for all of us. This would be like you going into a state or national forest, so long as you have a permit, and then cutting down all the trees and then selling it as lumber. That's a public resource. That would be no different. It's the same analogy. It's the same thing. That's what we're talking about here. It was about 2004, the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife decided to start keeping this data. And they had no idea what it was going to be for until about 2011, 2012 timeframe, when sport fishermen from Kentucky really started getting angry and complaining to their Fish and Wildlife Department. So they said, we'll look into it. Well, they did. They looked into it. This is probably the most extensive, in-depth study as far as overall data that has ever been collected in the entire history of our country, as far as inland commercial fisheries is concerned. Several of these huge studies, 2 of them were done by Kentucky. One of them is called the Ohio River Catfish Project. So the first one we're going to talk about is basically just a statewide fishing survey that was conducted by Kentucky. And what they did was, going back to 2004, they took all of the data, and every year they made an annual report for that year. And so the first graph I want to look at right now is basically this graph here that shows you the species of fish that they tend to be targeting. As you can see, there was a huge push in 2012 to go after blue cats, and also in 2021. Look at the number of pounds these people are taking out. I mean, this is just Kentucky, right? We're not talking about the commercial sector from the Indiana side or the Ohio side. We're just looking at Kentucky right now. You'll notice something very interesting about this graph. Everything sort of just kind of moves along properly, and you have this fairly normal line, but something happens right around 2012 and 2021. So when I first looked at all these graphs and all these data and studies, I actually agreed with Kentucky. And when I looked at Indiana's, which we'll get to in a minute, I actually agreed with them because I couldn't find anything in the data that would say otherwise. For 2 months, I basically became consumed with this stuff. How did they come to these conclusions? I'm missing something and I don't know what it is. And then I decided, you know what? I'm going to put this down. I'm going to set it down, and we're just going to walk away. This actually began back in February for me. So after, it was like the 3rd day of not thinking about it, I didn't look at my phone, I didn't look at any of the data, I didn't look at the studies, I didn't look up new ones, I didn't care. I was just trying to separate myself from this crap. I had sort of a eureka moment. Once I got away from the data, I literally in my brain started picking apart all of the data. What I found very interesting about this graph in particular right here is that something interesting happened in 2012 to 2014. 2012 specifically. In the state of Kentucky, wildlife officials were going through and actually going with commercial fishermen. That's where this data is pulled from, by the way. This is data directly from commercial fishermen. Why is there such a huge spike in 2012 and another massive spike in 2021? Interestingly enough, and you'll see this in other graphs, wildlife officials were actually going with them. So they were being forced to tell the truth. If you ask me, this line is probably a lot closer if you look at 2012 and 2021. I think your numbers that are being actually pulled out are closer to that. The interesting thing about all this data is when it started being collected in 2004, nobody, including the commercial fishermen, had no idea how it was going to be used against or for them. So nobody knew. The agencies didn't know. But underreporting has never been like a taboo thing to talk about in the commercial world. It's always been a known quantity. Every state agency in the United States in regards to inland commercial fishing will tell you that they have no accurate way of knowing what is actually being caught by commercial fishermen, because you would literally have to post an agent at every single boat ramp and every single point of access. You would have there's no resources for that. A lot of times these people put their boats in at nighttime, they run their hoop nets and their trot lines at nighttime, and then they're gone. And they're on the road with their live fish. And then they dump them off at daylight, usually at these places. And the reason they wait till daylight is so when they get to these pay lakes, they can take a nice, beautiful daytime picture of all these fish. There was a 3-year study done in the state of Kentucky where they investigated, I believe it was like 68 pay lakes, trophy pay lakes. 28 of those pay lakes received citations and fines. Out of those 28 pay lakes that were charged, I think there was a total of like 63 charges levied against them. Almost all of them centered around having no paperwork whatsoever on the fish that they possessed in their ponds. There was none, no record keeping. You better hurry up, it's gonna rain. So that just goes to show you, as far as I'm concerned, and as far as everyone, that anytime somebody does a study and they utilize commercial fishing data from logs that they have turned in every month, it's void. It doesn't mean anything. It's information that it's a known quantity that it is inaccurate. So we really have no idea what they're taking out of there. So with this information, Kentucky decided to make a change. The number of commercial fishers awarded trophy permits was reduced to 15. It was previously 50. There will be no more than 2 licensed commercial fishermen per boat. If more are present, they may only keep 2 limits of trophy catfish. A possession limit, twice the daily limit, was placed on trophy catfish for commercial fisheries. This applies when on the water and when trailering fish. So they actually won that one. It basically limited the numbers and sizes of fish that commercial fishermen were allowed to take for the very first time. This was fought over hard even after they won. It wasn't until like almost a year, or just a little after a year later, before these new regulations were actually enforceable because of all the appeals that the commercial side was putting in. So good on you, Kentucky. You actually did that one. Simultaneously, this was going on. The Ohio River Catfishing Project, was actually going on as well. And again, it was just another study that was a little bit more in depth. It kind of took a different role where it went directly to sending flyers and sending questionnaires and stuff out to people. In this study, they looked at a lot of things. They looked at tournament weights from all over the country. They also sampled themselves with hoop nets. Kentucky did. They also used trot lines and things like that. To try and sample the catfish population and see where it's at, but also see where the fishermen were at with it. They were trying to get a hold on how many people were actually trophy catfishing. The best piece of information that came out of this was sort of part of my eureka moment when it came to understanding why this data is not making sense. How is this even possible? One of the things that after my 3 days off from poring over this stuff and my hair falling out, I asked myself, where is all the data from the places where they don't allow commercial fishing? Because all of these studies that have been done, commercial fishing has already been in place and has been for decades. So when Indiana and Kentucky use words like catch rates are satisfactory, catch rates are average, therefore we don't recommend anything. They love to use that stuff. But commercial fishing has already been there. We don't know what those waters are like pre-commercial fishing. We have no idea. We have some idea of pre-trophy commercial fishing. Absolutely. Back in the 80s and 90s when catfishing was really booming, the trophy catfishing world was really booming. When catfishermen were practicing selective harvest, going after smaller fish, 1 to 4 pounds, because that's a fillet fish. However, we have no data from any of these places that means anything because they've all had commercial fishing going on at the exact same time. Insert Missouri. So back in 1992, Missouri banned all commercial fishing for paddlefish, sturgeon, I think shovel-nosed sturgeon, and all catfish in its Missouri waters. The problem, however, is several of their rivers border other states. And when you have border states like the Ohio River, the Missouri, the Mississippi, you don't get to just do whatever you want on your side of the river. You actually have to co-govern those rivers. And so there are huge swaths of the Missouri that actually can be commercial fished. However, within the confines of Missouri, the Missouri River cannot be commercially fished for catfish. They are, however, commercially fished for things like buffalo and carp. And when you see some of the graphs That's mostly what they're talking about. But if you go back to the graphs that show 1992, 1991, you just see the catfish plummet in these rivers, in the Missouri River, basically across all of these rivers. Like, these commercial fishermen just leave, largely, except for the ones that were targeting buffaloes and stuff like that. Here's a graph from the Ohio Catfish Project, Ohio River Catfish Project, that shows this. It's a very interesting graph. If you look at the blue line, you can see that over time, Missouri just keeps getting better and better. It really does. Missouri is going to be the new Tennessee River of the catfishing world, in my opinion. I think it will eventually be. Tennessee is still a great fishery, the Tennessee River, and all of its reservoirs. It's got a rich fishing tradition. It's going to be there a long time for fishermen to enjoy. However, I think Missouri is going to overtake it as probably one of the #1 destinations, primarily because they don't allow commercial fishing. The people that lived there said back in the 90s they used to tussle with 10 to 15 pound fish, and now they're seeing 60, 70 pound fish that they're pulling up. I mean, we're seeing monster fish coming out of the Missouri right now, and we have for the last several years. This is one of the key graphs that sort of shows you that when fish are allowed to be left alone and to prosper, and the public resource is allowed to be managed by the public and not be given over to commercial fishing. This is something that we should have been arguing. I know some of this information could be very dry, but we're going to get to the good stuff. We're going to get to the economics behind this, and it looks like I'm going to get rained on. Of course, there are thunderstorms possible in the next hour. Okay, so back in 2014, Indiana sort of started this whole process about a year after Kentucky did, and it basically played out the exact same way. The studies were a little bit different. Indiana relied primarily on things like creel reports. We can talk about creel reports in a minute. They also utilized electroshock technology, as well as monitoring the commercial activity that was going on the Ohio and on the Wabash and the White River. Basically, all Indiana did was they adopted similar rules to Kentucky in the terms of lengths and weights and stuff like that you're allowed to keep. And it was really one of those moments where IDNR and Kentucky DNR collectively in 2014 and Indiana in 2015 just sort of went like that. Like, okay, we did you catfishermen a favor. We've thrown you a bone. We're going to get back to our trout and walleye. And Kentucky was like, we're going to get back to our Lake Barkley and whatever the hell else you Kentuckians do down there. You know, we're done with this. We're done. We've helped the catfish world. We're done. The problem was the commercial fishermen weren't done. And the trophy catfishing community and the catfishing community at large wasn't done either. They started griping again here in Indiana. And it started at about 2020, 2019. And the ICCA, which is the Indiana Catfish Conservation Association, drew up amendments to the catfishing regulations that exist in my state. In October of 2022, these went before the Indiana Department of Natural Resources and lawmakers in the state assembly, and they let's just say that their demands were not met. These are basically a few of the rules that the amendments that they were proposing. Allow the daily harvest of one blue over 30 inches, which was a downward trend of 5 inches. One flathead, also 30 inches, and one channel cat for 24 inches. Place a daily bag limit of catfish taken from streams and rivers at 10. Currently it's unlimited. Ban the travel of live adult catfish across state lines in order to keep an Indiana resource in Indiana. You would think that one would be enough to be like, well, yeah, of course, it's an Indiana resource. Taxpayers pay for it. People that spend money in Indiana, that money goes back into the resources here in Indiana. So you would assume that we wouldn't be taking, yeah, we might get dumped on here, I don't know. So basically what happened, commercial fishermen showed up, people from the ICCA showed up, but also catfishermen at large showed up. They both stated their cases, and IDNR said, we're gonna go convene with our council and we're gonna get back to you guys. They did. IDNR got back with them, and what they did was they basically took studies. I can't believe I'm not getting soaked right now. So they sent back a response, and their response was essentially, we don't recommend anything being done at this time. We're going to continue to monitor catfish populations, which they have done. But let's just look at their answer. If you really want to get to the heart of why nothing's being done about this, you really need only look at the data that they're looking at, and you have to look at it in the way that they're looking at it. One thing to keep in mind is people are scientists. They're scientists and they're government employees. They did the studies, They come up with the data, they have to stand by it. Because if they didn't, it would almost make them incompetent. Their exact words were, the DNR recommends no actions towards banning the interstate travel of live and adult fish. So they're literally saying right there, we don't care if you take fish out of Indiana. We don't care if you take our big, live, trophy fish out of Indiana. They can do this with almost any fish. Let's just start by addressing creel reports. This is the portion of the video where we start to push back a little bit against the data, where we start to look at it and say, no, wait a minute. We're not blindly following this. We're gonna tear it apart. First things first, in October of 2022, I've already talked about the data that the state of Indiana used to shoot down all of the proposed catfishing regulations, mostly creel reports. The problem with creel reports is, if you don't know what a creel report is, it's basically where you go and you use social media to create a survey, or you can send out emails, or you can literally send a letter and have it sent back to the state. Or like in this case, in the 2019 creel report on the East Fork of White River, they literally went to popular fishing places and asked the fishermen questions. You can probably see where the problems in that would lie. For example, they got like 500 surveyors in one day. That day was the free fishing day, meaning the people that they were asking pretty significant policy making decision questions were people that fish one day a year, or maybe don't fish one day in 5 years. And they were taking the data from that and literally using it as a way to make policy decisions based on catfishing regulations. You can see where that would be problematic. So I approached the big fisheries, or the big river fisheries biologist. I think his name at the time was Dave Kataka. I don't know what he's doing now. But he even agreed with me. He was like, yeah, it's not an exact science, clearly. We know that a good portion of the people that we're asking are people that are literally using their spinning reels upside down. We get it. We understand. So then why are you using it? Why You're literally making a decision based on people's feelings, because you're asking them questions like, well, what do you think about the overall health of the river? That guy's not been there in 5 years. What do you mean? Why? That just blows my mind. But that's a creel report, and they use these all over the United States, and they're basically just a way for them to understand the public's perception of a fishery. They shouldn't be used to determine or dictate policy change. It's a ridiculous notion, but they used it against us. So let's just look at the economics, because it's like the most blaring, obvious choice that you would never allow commercial fishing to take hold in your fishery for a number of reasons. Economic is probably one of the biggest. For those of you that are unfamiliar with NOAA is, holy crap, NOAA is the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. They're really an organization that is funded federally and has their fingers in everything that has to do with the environment, the weather, climate, whatever, and also the economics surrounding them, including they do keep some statistics on fishing. Most of it is offshore commercial fishing, but they also dabble in inland commercial fishing and inland recreational fishing. They estimate that the worldwide inland fisheries, commercial inland fisheries, produces about $26 billion for local economies. Subsequently, on the other half of that coin, recreational fisheries produce about $190 billion. That's a factor of 7.3 times more. Let me explain why that's even greater in the United States of America. In the U.S., the way commercial fishing, especially trophy catfishing, is practiced, this is not a good model to then take that and say, oh, well, so your fishery is 7.5 times more valuable as a recreational fishery versus a commercial. It's even more than that. Let me explain. When you go to these other countries, predominantly in Asia, local inland commercial fisheries are way bigger to the local economies, because what happens is these people go out on these rivers, they catch the fish in India, China, Japan, Korea, everywhere, right? They bring the fish in to port. The fish are unloaded at port, are immediately sold to the market, and then the market then sells them to the local inhabitants. It's all the wealth that is created and generated by that industry is right there in those communities. And it is a big part of those communities. Whole livelihoods, thousands, maybe even millions of people in the local areas that are affected by this. That's not how it works in the United States. Only a very few places that we're talking about actually practice anything remotely close to that. And even then it's not. For example, the James River, there's a lot of filleted fish commercially fished there, where they're actually getting those fish for human consumption. Those fish are then processed at a processing facility very nearby and then frozen, shipped everywhere. So it's sort of the same thing, but it's still a much wider area. Let's look at trophy catfish. Let's look at the process that occurs there. You have a couple of fishermen that come in, catch their fish, head to the port of entry, and then transport those fish hundreds of miles away. Hundreds of miles. They're caught in Kentucky waters, Illinois waters, Mississippi waters, sometimes illegally in Tennessee, Alabama. They are then transported hundreds and hundreds of miles away to places like Ohio and upstate Indiana, Kentucky. That does nothing for those local economies. It hurts them dramatically, because I mean, you can see where I'm going with this. Also, the wealth that is created by that is very limited to the amount of people that are involved. You're not feeding thousands of people. You're not producing jobs for hundreds of people subsequently in that area. You're basically just employing a couple of fishermen, and then it's transported hundreds and hundreds of miles away, not even in the same state as these fisheries. So you're taking resources away from their departments and giving them to others. You're not helping anybody. So that model is even less. The American Sport Fishing Association estimate that American sport fishing constitutes about $129 billion, whereas NOAA says in the United States alone it's 148. So the United States is very heavy on the recreational fishing side. I would say it would be a far stretch to say that inland commercial fisheries produce more than, probably a couple $1 billion. So that would be a much greater ratio. In the United States, the inland commercial fishing model doesn't work. The ratio is so bad against commercial fishing that it would kind of make you wonder that if you're cheating these little communities out of all that money, it's almost criminal to think about that all those jobs are being taken away. There's even a portion of it that makes you wonder if there's not corruption at play, because there's just absolutely no way you can justify. When you look at the restaurants, when you look at the hotels, all of the boat rentals, the boat repair shops, the gas stations, these employ thousands of people throughout these communities that live along these fisheries. When you allow commercial fishing to come in, you're basically putting the death nail in their coffin, because once those fisheries dry up from commercial fishing, or other fisheries who aren't being hit as hard by commercial fishing, those are now drawing the crowds. Those communities get destroyed. If you don't believe me, go down to Leavenworth, Indiana, or Cannleton, Indiana, on your nicest pair of shoes. Take a stroll down those roads and let me know how that works out for you. These communities have been devastated. And what happens to communities that become poor? They become crime-ridden. These are not nice places. Fishermen don't want to leave their boat trailers. They don't want to leave their trucks in these places because they're pretty nefarious. Trucks, tires get slashed. Vehicles get broken into, your things get stolen. These are crime-ridden neighborhoods that are virtually not policed at all. And it's because people don't have jobs there. They don't have livelihoods. They don't have purpose. And what happens with human beings that don't have purpose, they get into drugs and they get into other crimes and things like that. And that's these little communities all along these fisheries that used to be thriving. We've all seen them. We all know what they are. Sport fishing in the United States, like I said, it brings in about $129 billion according to the American Sport Fishing Association. And that equates to a total of about 826,000 jobs directly related to recreational and sport fishing. That's like $40 billion in wages. That's $40 billion going to middle class and poor people. Tell me again about how your commercial fishing is your livelihood. Yeah, catfish are right now considered third in all sport fish in the United States in economic value, meaning that the people that are fishing for them are third in the country in spending the most money. Within the next couple of years, we are going to overtake them and become a strong number two. Currently, as it stands, we are number two in popularity. Catfishing in the United States is now number two. I did not know that I would ever see that. I had a hope that we would become number 2. We are now poised that within the next 15 to 20 years, overtaking bass fishing as the most popular sport fishing genre in the entire United States. Let that sink in for just a minute. The unfortunate part about that, basically all of our limits, all of our regulations are about 25 years behind. Catfishing has grown so fast, so quickly, and so under the radar that as state agencies have not realized the market value in these fish and the fishermen that chase them. Let me tell you who did. Rod and reel companies like Penn, Daiwa, Abu Garcia, Shakespeare, all of these big names back in the early 2000s figured this out like that. They were, I mean, most of the time when you look at the gear that's being used on catfish today, that stuff didn't exist. If you're new to catfishing, let me explain to you really quickly what catfishing was in the mid-90s. Catfishing in the mid-90s and all the time before that was basically Zebco 33s, 404s, 808s, stuff like that. We were pulling flatheads, 25, 30 pounders out from under log jams with Zebco 33s and 17-pound tests because there was nothing else. There was nothing marketed to us during that time. Nothing. That's what was marketed to us. These big rod and reel companies, they were on the coastlines selling giant sea offshore gear. Then they figured it out. They started marketing that to them. The data didn't exist back then, but now it does. A lot of people may not think this is true, but it's 100% true. Freshwater sport fishing is about 2 to 3 times bigger than offshore fishing, saltwater. It's about 2 to 3 times bigger in terms of overall economic money generated. Let's just break down some of the numbers real quick on how much money we spend on things as a sport fishery. We spend $600 million a year on ice. That's bags of ice going into gas stations buying ice. $600 million a year. The number one purchase by sport fishermen is food. We spend about $4 billion on food. So that's getting off the lake, hitting restaurants, that's stopping at gas stations, that's stopping at restaurants to have breakfast, whatever. $4 billion. I would argue that the entire inland commercial fishery does not earn $4 billion. And we spend that on food. And if they do make more than that, let's just throw the ice on top of it and say it's almost $5 billion. They don't make that. That's just that. Let's look at some other ones here. Lodging, $3.1 billion. Bait is $1.5 billion. We spend $1.5 billion on live bait. We spend $1.1 billion on lures. We spend $1.8 billion on boat fuel. $1.8 billion. There's dozens of things on here that we're spending anywhere from $500 million to $1 billion on. You're cheating all of these towns, all of these businesses, small town, poor people who are trying to earn a living selling bait, selling tackle, fixing boats, selling boats. You're cheating all these communities out of a good life just so you can let these fish be taken upstate. So a bunch of people in the middle of Ohio can gamble on catching big fish. That's the price you're paying for it. Let's talk about the blue cats ecologically and the flatheads ecologically for just a second. We have a real problem in our country with invasive species, more specifically the Asian carp. Now, I've talked about this a couple of years ago on a video called Why Our Rivers Suck, and nobody watched it because nobody really cares about conservation. Based on the YouTube algorithms and the amount of time people spend watching those videos, it's just not popular. Nobody cares. The number one predator of Asian carp is blue catfish. This first came on my radar after doing a tournament on the Ohio River, and we were having to take turns literally netting out carcasses of silver carp that these blue cats, after we caught a couple 25, 30 pounders, they were just barfing up these skeletons. And they stunk, it reeked, and we had to keep the water quality high, so we were constantly just ripping these things out of the water. That's when we realized just how much they were eating. And then subsequently a few studies came out. One of them was from Michigan State University, where they took 68 blue cats and examined their stomach contents, and what they found was the number one prey item was Asian carp, and those Asian carp averaged 3.9 years of age. The reason that's very significant is because female Asian carp reach sexual maturity between 3 and 4 years of age. So you've got a fish here that is doing the work for us, that is working harder than you and me and for cheaper than anything we will ever accomplish. And we're allowing them to be taken out of the rivers for money, and not even very much money. That in itself is an excellent argument to be made. This is who we're losing to.
The only thing I'm taking is fish out this motherfucking river for y'all to catch. So anybody running their motherfucking mouth about me, you tell them. Corey Jackson said, fuck you. Well, it's been brought to my attention that all my hoop nets are on exposing PAYLAKES, or PAYLAKES, whatever they are. So one of y'all motherfuckers is a bunch of fucking snitches. Y'all on here sneaking. And let me tell you something about sneaks. They get got. I'll be on the river every day, every morning, every night. Hey, we hauling fish right now. Raping a river near you. Fuck yourself. Don't forget that. The raping will commence immediately.
And this is also who we're losing to.
Don't worry about dead fish. We got it covered on our end. If there's fish dying, we'll bring in more. Somebody come the other day, said there was 20 dead fish in the lake. Listen, we got fish dead in the lake. We got fish coming in every day to replace them. So we're not concerned about the dead fish. It's just part of the game. That's why we stock every month. We keep the fish replaced. The fish are coming in.
This is what they think. This is how they think. This is what we're doing. These are pay lake owners, commercial fishing, or both. One of the common arguments that's made in favor of pay lakes is it allows old people and children a chance and an opportunity to catch a big fish that otherwise wouldn't. You can go to any one of their websites, their Facebook pages, which they post on every single day. They're dropping in thousands of pounds of these fish weekly, sometimes bi-weekly, sometimes monthly, just depending on when the commercial fishermen can get them. Let me just blow that argument right out of the water and say, you don't see any old people. It is standing room only, and these are able-bodied 20 to 30-year-old men taking pictures with these fish. They are lying to you. So lastly, there is one portion of the data I want to speak on. Who keeps track? This is from the USGS. The Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations estimates that 11.6 million tons of fish were harvested through global inland commercial fisheries in 2016. However, several studies indicate that inland fish harvests are underestimated and underreported worldwide. For larger fisheries, this may be due to inefficiencies in monitoring or reporting systems, unregulated or illegal fishing, or a desire to avoid taxation, while small-scale fishers may lack the ability to monitor harvest or rely on flawed methods for estimating harvest. These issues diminish our understanding of the economic and food value of inland commercial fisheries, with potential implications for the protection of inland fish habitats. That is the United States of America. That is the federal government stating, we have no idea how accurate any of this stuff is. These people claim to know more about recreational harvest and recreational fishing than they do commercial logs. Think about that for a second. There's no one turning in logs from the recreational harvests. Have you ever called and told the state that you caught 18 crappies today? No. This is probably the most important line in regards to this entire issue, and the federal government is saying this. In the United States, for example, no comprehensive compilation of inland commercial fisheries exists because fish harvests are typically underreported due to a lack of systemic data collection. Explain to me how they can tell us with a significant degree of accuracy what recreational fishermen are taking, what they're using, how many of them are going. None of you are turning in your logs because you're not required to. Have you ever gotten off the lake and said, hey, I caught 8 channel cats and 18 crappies today? Just letting you guys know. Click. No, you've never done that. No one's ever done that. Commercial fishermen every 30 days are required to turn in a log. So you're telling me you know more about the fish we're taking and how many of us are doing it than the people that are literally required to turn in logs every month? You're telling me that? You see how crazy that is? They address here that they have no way of knowing whether any of the things that are being reported are accurate and to begin with. They have no idea. There's an argument to be made that people say if you can't regulate something, then you probably shouldn't have it. I don't know if that's the best argument to have. I think it works in this case. I don't think it works for every case, because you can't technically regulate recreational fishing either. You would have to have a guy or gal, a guard shack at every boat ramp, every port of entry to every waterway, checking everybody every time they come in. Who wants to live in a country like that? That's what would have to happen. Let's talk about the ACA real quick. I'm guilty of this. I would say I was privately critical of the ACA. I wasn't publicly critical, but I think a lot of people are. I think one thing we have to keep in mind with the ACA is that it's essentially one person. It's one person. It's not this giant organization that you probably think it is, that I personally thought it was, until a roundtable discussion that took place with a bunch of fishermen. I thought it had like its own departments full of people. Boy, no, it's basically one guy. I'd love to hear what you guys have to say on the issue. If you feel I left something out or you want to have a discussion about something, leave it in the comments. I will be putting my email down below. I'm willing to talk to anyone. I couldn't get anybody to go on camera with this. Nobody wanted to go on camera at all. Fishermen, I reached out to Pay Lake owners, I reached out to commercial fishermen. None of them wanted to go on camera. I hope you guys enjoyed that video. I hope you got something out of it. Like and share. Monetization is turned off for this video. I'm not making a dime off of it. I want the message out. I don't care about money. Hope you guys have a good day. Go catch some fish.